Okay, the video camera's on. Hello everyone, and thank you for coming, and welcome to the chapter meeting of the Delaware Valley Chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. We are DVAU. You can find us on the web at dvau.org, and if you visit our website, you'll find links to our Facebook and Twitter and other social media accounts. DVAU has been around since 2003. We have meetings like this where we bring in speakers to talk about important church-state issues. We provide speakers to the local area. We also get involved in church-state issues. We're involved in several issues in New Jersey right now. One is a church-state separation lawsuit where the state of New Jersey is trying to disperse $11 million to two religious schools for groundskeeping purposes, and we are suing to stop them from sending that money to those schools. And that case is still pending. No money has been dispersed yet, so there's nothing to take back. So that case is still pending. And in other news, Governor Christie is trying to sneak school vouchers into the school budget, into the education budget for the fiscal year 16. He thinks we didn't notice, but we noticed. And we defeated vouchers in 2011. They keep trying to introduce the Opportunity Scholarship Act in New Jersey. It has been defeated repeatedly for over a decade. Every time they bring it up, it gets knocked down. It is illegal in New Jersey. We cannot have taxpayer money paying for religious education. And DVAU is very active with a coalition of education groups in New Jersey in fighting school vouchers. And in a couple weeks, I'm going to go testify before the budget committee and tell those people that we are not going to sit back and let them put vouchers in the budget. They can't even vote to approve this act. They can't sneak it into the budget. That's not right. So I'm going to go and testify and tell them they can't do that. So tonight we have two wonderful speakers. We're having an issue that is right in the news right now, aid in dying or death with dignity. Our two speakers tonight are Ethan Andersen and Barbara Mancini. Ethan Andersen has been a field organizer with Compassion and Choices since February of 2014. He'll be graduating from Rutgers University this May. He's been a humanist from early childhood. Raised a Unitarian Universalist, he feels that government and religion play two very different roles in society that should be kept separate under all circumstances. His presentation will cover topics including the Catholic Church's activities opposing aid in dying legislation, religious arguments against passing death with dignity laws, and common responses to said arguments. Barbara Mancini lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania with her husband and two teenage daughters. She's been a nurse for over 2 decades. In 2013, she was arrested and prosecuted in Pennsylvania on the charge of aiding the attempted suicide of her dying 93-year-old father after handing him his prescribed morphine 4 days before his death. A hospice nurse and police ignored his written advance directives, and he was hospitalized and treated in defiance of his end-of-life wishes. Barbara's prosecution lasted a year, during which time it garnered national attention and it was roundly criticized through the media. Her case was dismissed when a Schuylkill County Court judge, the Honorable Jacqueline Russell, granted her petition for habeas corpus, concluding that a jury may not receive a case where it must rely on conjecture to reach a verdict. As the case presented to the court would not warrant submission to a jury due to the lack of competent evidence elicited by the Commonwealth on the crime charged, with the Commonwealth's reliance on the speculation and guess serving as an appropriate means to prove its case. Defendant's position for habeas corpus is being granted. She was interviewed about her case on TV's 60 Minutes and has become a vocal advocate for end-of-life choice. She will discuss how religion has influenced the laws and end-of-life cases and how specifically became an issue in her case. Barbara's going to be giving a full presentation to our chapter on May 7th in this room, which will be a multimedia presentation with a screen down. It will be really interesting. I gave everyone some handouts that will describe that talk, and that will be at 7 p.m. on May 7th. And Ethan is going to go first, I guess, to talk about the role of religious right, and then Barbara will follow up with a little bit of courtesy sense as well. Thank you very much, Ethan.
Thank you very much, Janice. So, some of you are familiar faces, some not, and that's very good as well. My name is Ethan Andersen. I'm as Janice mentioned, I'm a field organizer with Compassion and Choices. The overall goal of Compassion and Choices is to expand and improve end-of-life care and options for terminally ill patients. So that means we help people fill out their advanced directives, we offer free end-of-life consulting, and on the advocacy side, we push forward aid and dying type legislation that would allow terminally ill, mentally competent adults the choice to self-administer medication that would end their own lives in a peaceful and dignified way. So, really the overall goal is better end-of-life care, and the aid and dying option is just one small part of that. But that's one that we advocate for since some of the other options are already in place, such as having advanced directives or opposed orders. So it's also very exciting to have Barbara here today. I'm so glad you're here. I met Barbara in Connecticut, and she's just wonderful, so you'll really enjoy her part as well. So, what got me involved in this issue was I was about halfway through college, and I'm a finance major, and I had done work with several business internships, and I decided that I would try and spice my resume a little bit. I worked on Cory Booker's Senate campaign, and although I went in there with, I wouldn't say impure motives, but I thought, yeah, this will make me look better for employers, at the end of it I realized, wow, that was really fulfilling work, and regardless of your political affiliation, you can still find importance in registering people to vote, and that was the main thing that I did. So I registered over 100 people to vote, both Republican and Democrat alike, and so I got involved in advocacy, and it brought me here. So I'm going to give you a brief little background on the Aid and Dying for the Terminally Ill Act, which is a piece of legislation here in New Jersey. Well, actually, we're not in New Jersey. I'm used to speaking to people in New Jersey for the most part, so I have to adapt it. I'll go over the Aid and Dying for the Terminally Ill Act. I'll briefly summarize the religious component, i.e. how the Catholic Church and the religious right has worked hard to prevent bills across the U.S. from being passed, and then I'll turn it over to Barbara. So, what the Aid and Dying for the Terminally Ill Act would do is it would allow a terminally ill, mentally competent adult the choice to self-administer a life-ending medication. So there are a couple of key components there. First of all, you have to be terminally ill. So that means you have to be in the process of dying with less than 6 months to live as diagnosed by 2 or more doctors. It would be less than 6 months to live because that's the same deadline as hospice. You have to have less than 6 months to live to qualify for hospice. And you would have to have 2 or more doctors give you that diagnosis. That way it's not just whoever your attending physician may be, you have to have 2 or more doctors give that diagnosis. The other component is that you have to be mentally competent, so to be of sound mind and be able to make decisions regarding your own health care, your own body, and be 18 or older, so it means to be at the age of consent or older. So those first 3 guidelines are essentially saying is that you have to be dying, and you have to know you're dying, and be in such a state that we deem you competent to make the best decisions for yourself. And this is not a choice, this is not an option that someone else can make for you. You can't have a proxy for the aid and dying option. If you fall into a coma, you can't have someone else say, yes, they want that. If you're going to choose, you have to choose it for yourself. And that really just underlines the idea that this is just a choice. So it would be a terminally ill, mentally competent adult who would also self-administer the medication. That's a key point here, is that if you chose this option, if you realized, okay, I'm dying, I'm a mentally competent adult, and I want this choice, you would be taking it yourself. No doctor would be giving it to you. So that really emphasizes the fact that even if you went through all these steps, you would still, in the end, be taking it yourself because it's your body. And I think the fact that you would have to self-administer the medication if you chose to take it is a reason why it's worked so well in states like Oregon and Washington. I'll go over that in a minute. So, terminally ill, mentally competent, you would have to make 2 or more requests for the medication at least 15 days apart, and your doctor would have to go over all options with you. So if you told your doctor, hey, I'm dying, I'm in pain, and I want this option for myself, your doctor would have to go over and say aggressive treatments, or hospice, or no care at all, cover all of them. Personally speaking, I have no preference when it comes to what options you have at the end of life. Because really, actually, it would be the end of your life. It's your life, it's your death, it should be your choice. It's sort of the slogan we have at Compassion and Choices. And really, that makes sense to me, because I don't think this is a one-size-fits-all issue. We all are different people with our own different backgrounds and belief structures, and we will all eventually have our own causes for dying, and I think that you can't just say, all right, this is the best way to do it for everyone. So for some people, aid and dying might be the best option. For the majority of people, it probably won't. And statistics from Oregon and other states where it's a legal option show that the vast majority of people that become terminally ill don't take this option. So your doctor have to go over all options with you. Two or more requests is just to make sure that you're really aware of the choice that you're making. And if you ever watch the documentary How to Die in Oregon, it's on Netflix, it's really good. I recommend, well, first of all, getting Netflix, because it's really good, and then watching How to Die in Oregon. You'll see a volunteer asking the person before they take the medication, do you know what you're doing, and are you sure this is what you want? You can back out at any time. And as you'll see in a minute, 1/3 of the patients that receive this medication in states where it's become legal end up not taking it at all. So they pass away from the disease that they are suffering from. And that just underscores the idea that this is just a choice for people, and it's not one that people are actively jumping to. I remember seeing a political cartoon that was drawn up before aid and dying became a legal option in Oregon, and it showed a busload of people, of terminally ill people, going towards Oregon. And it sort of implied that if aid and dying becomes an option, everyone's going to rush off to Oregon and end their own lives. But really, as human beings, we have two very, very strong instincts, and that's to reproduce and to survive. And to exercise the aid and dying option goes against one of those, and it's not something that comes naturally to us. And that's why most people don't end up taking the medication. This is for people for which their pain, for which their dignity and autonomy is not manageable by a hospice or other forms of palliative care. So there are a good number of safeguards in the aid and dying bill. I'd say the strongest one is that if you try to convince someone to take or not take the medication, that would be deemed a felony and you would go to jail. And I think of all the safeguards, a pretty strong one would be, yeah, if you mess with this, we're gonna lock you up. And I think that's another reason why this law has worked so well in other states, is because, well, people are disinclined to mess with it in that case. But also because you have to be terminally ill with less than 6 months to live. So although chances are that you would save money, spent on healthcare if you choose the aid and dying option over some other option, it's still 6 months of healthcare. It's not 10 years. But this is really, for me, I heard it described well once that the people leaving from the World Trade Center were never considered to be suicidal. No one ever said, oh, there are thousands of people that committed suicide. And that's because these were people that were going to die, for which the end was inevitable. And I think the same could be applied here, is that this is exclusively for people that are not only terminally ill and mentally competent adults, but they also have less than 6 months to live as diagnosed by 2 or more doctors. And yes, of course, we know that medicine is not an exact science where we can predict the exact date and time that you're going to pass away, but at the same time, when you have 2 or more doctors giving you this diagnosis, we also assume that you, as a mentally competent adult, are aware that there's always some chance that you might pull out of it and that you can make that decision for yourself. And we leave it up to you. I think a lot of this bill, it comes down to respect. Respect for other people and allowing them to make that choice for themselves. And you might have a family member who wants a different option than you might want, but part of that respect you might have for that family member is letting them make that choice for themselves, wherever that choice may be. So, the bill has a lot of safeguards, as you can tell, and in my opinion, that's how it should be. That makes sense to me. This is not an issue that should be taken lightly. I think it requires conversation, it requires a dialogue. And after Barbara and I are finished talking, then I would welcome you to ask questions, and we'll address any you may have. And I've heard some crazy ones, but you seem like a good group, so I look forward to that. I like the Q&A, it's fun. But so there's a lot of safeguards, that's how it should be. And let me go over just how the law has worked in Oregon briefly before I go into the New Jersey bill. So in the 17 years that aid and dying, well 18 now because it's 2015, I'm still getting used to writing the numbers on pieces of paper. In the 18 years that aid and dying has been a legal option in Oregon, there have been 0 documented signs of abuse, 0 documented cases of neglect. And that's for a couple reasons. 1, because very few people are taking medication. 2, because you would have to self-administer it. And 3, it says in the bill, if you tamper with this, you're going to go to jail. Now, the New Jersey aid and dying bill is modeled after Oregon's legislation. You can't exactly take a bill and cut and paste it into a different state because it's different regulations, different people writing the bill, but it's very similar. So it has the same safeguards that I mentioned about the New Jersey bill. Let's see, in 2014, 150 people received the medication, and 100 people self-administered. So again, about 2/3 of the people that receive it took it, and 1/3 didn't. And furthermore, 100 people took the medication, and on average, that's about 1 in 500 deaths in Oregon, so 0.02%. and that's very, very small. I believe it's, Oregon has a population of 3.5 million people, which is a lot of people, and so 100 medications, 100 scripts written in 1 year, it's not very much at all. And this option has been available for quite some time in Oregon, and a lot of people are aware of it, so it's not like no one knows about it and that's why no one's writing the script. It's because, again, people want to live. I've heard described that this is an option for people that would prefer to live but no longer have the option to do so. It's for people where really that's the only choice that makes sense to them at that point in time. And I think another statistic from Oregon that really underscores that is that the average amount of time between someone receiving this medication and taking it, for those that chose to take it, is 45 days. So on average, if you received medication, you waited a month and a half before taking it. And that really underscores the idea that people don't necessarily want to take this. I mean, they prefer, for some that do, they prefer it over any other option they have. They don't actively want to end their own life. This time that people really think over. They really, those 15 days generally, they wait longer than that. And that's because this is not a choice that people arrive at easily, and yet it is one that I think is important that we have. Of the top 3 reasons people cited for taking the medication in states where it's become legal, the top 3 cited reasons were loss of dignity, loss of autonomy, and pain. Pain has never been the #1 cause of people taking this medication in all the years that Oregon has had this illegal option. And that's interesting to note, because something that I'll hear from the opposition fairly often is, yes, well, what about pain relief? What about hospice? What about morphine? Well, if the top 2 reasons for people taking medication are loss of dignity and loss of autonomy, well, how exactly is morphine going to get that back for you? And I think that's worth noting. Now, it's also worth pointing out, this is not to say that the only dignified death is one in which you self-administer life-ending medication, and this is not saying that if you are not autonomous, then you shouldn't keep on living. That's absolutely not the case at all. Like I said, this is not a one-size-fits-all issue, and for some people, a lack of autonomy does not necessarily mean a lack of enjoyment out of life. For others, it might, and that's okay. And for those for which they can have a non-autonomous life and still be happy, that's fine too. The whole idea here is that this is your choice. This is your life. You should get to do with it what you want. And so long as you're a terminally ill, mentally incompetent adult, where you're actively dying and you also have this ability to make the decision for yourself, I really do think that the aid in dying option is a logical, reasonable one to have at your disposal. But no means is this an endorsement to say, yes, everyone should go take the medication. Let's see, on average, about 95% of people that took this medication were already on hospice, so 19 and 20. So, again, many members of the opposition will say, yes, well, what about hospice? And to that I say, well, 19 of the 20 people that took this medication were already on hospice. They already had extensive care. They already went through rigorous regimes of medications and chemotherapy, and really it's at this last point, this last station before the end of the road, that people just want to have this sense of control at the end that they wouldn't have without this medication. If you're a patient, you receive this medication in a state where it's legal, you can have it at your disposal. You can keep it in your drawer, you know where it is, and you don't have to worry about when things are going to go for you and how much pain there's going to be until then, because you have that choice available for you. I think that's a really important one to have. And 97% of people that took this medication passed away at home, which it's not entirely relevant, but I think it's just nice. I think people want to pass away at home for the most part, and they generally have a hard time doing so. And it's a hard issue to talk about. This is one that can be emotionally trying at times, and yet I think it's all the more important for us to have this discussion. Generally the best way to handle something is to talk about it and to just reduce that stigma and that taboo that comes with it. And we as Americans have a culture of not wanting to talk about death, about end-of-life care, and I think that's why in so many cases it's so bad. We have very advanced medical care in this country, and yet we have a lot of bad deaths, an unnecessarily large number of bad deaths, and it doesn't have to be that way if we have that discussion. So something I stress in a lot of presentations that I ask people to, even if you are vehemently opposed to aid in dying option, think it's a bad thing, and think I'm a bad person for talking about it, I would ask that you get an advance directive and you talk to your doctor and your family members about your end-of-life choices and what you want available at the end. And if you talk to your doctor about it, and if your doctor is not in line or supportive of your end-of-life choices, maybe get a new doctor. Just food for thought. So be sure to have this conversation. I definitely recommend it. I've been meaning to get an advance directive for a little while now. I keep putting it off, and so I guess do as I say, not as I do, but it's important. So the New Jersey bill is moving along well. We expect a full Senate vote sometime this May. It passed through the Assembly 41 to 31, and it was the third bill in the U.S. to pass through a state's assembly, or they call it a house in other states. I don't know what they call it here in Pennsylvania. I don't know what they call it. You call it a house, right? So I'm the odd one now. But it's moving along well. Governor Chris Christie is opposed to the bill. He's been taking a stronger pro-life stance lately. And so he still might end up voting yes for it, and I think one reason why he might do that is because 63% of New Jersey voters support this issue. There's pretty much every state where we've done polling, we found a majority of people supported this issue. Nationwide, it's about 70%. So it's a very, New Jersey, like Pennsylvania, you guys are smart. I think most Pennsylvanians support this issue as well. In terms of reasons why someone might oppose this bill, some reasons are from a religious background, stating the old God gave life, God takes life, and so therefore we can't get in the way of that. My general response to that would be, yes, that may be your belief, and that's fine, so don't take the medication, but don't get in the way of other people taking the medication, because we all have our own religious beliefs. And there's no denying that we all incorporate our own background beliefs into our end-of-life decision-making. So you should just let people choose whatever's best for them. If I had to say there was a way to summarize this whole bill and this movement, is pretty much just let mentally competent adults do what they want with their end-of-life care. Let people make their own decisions at the end. Let them bring their own background into their decision-making. Some other decisions may come from some objections may be, for example, the Hippocratic Oath states that doctors must first do no harm. My response to that would be, well, first do no harm is different for every patient. For some patients, doing harm would be saying you have to do this the way your body decides it, not you, the person, decides it. I think it's important that people can make that choice for themselves, and that for some people, better care means better options. I've heard some people express concerns that if an aid and dying became a legal option in their state, that they would abandon medical care as a whole, that people would stop working on improving medical care. And Oregon is on the leading edge of palliative care in the U.S., so it's not true at all. Not only can you have better care and better options, but the two are often hand in hand. They are not mutually exclusive. I remember I gave a presentation in Medford, which is in South Jersey, about a year ago, and a gentleman asked me, well, why are you talking about this issue? Why don't you go become a doctor and save people's lives instead of talking about death? And, well, it's actually really intertwined. Death is a part of life, and it's one that you should probably talk about. I do think that although I'm currently advocating for people to have better options at the end of life, yes, of course, we want better pain relief measures and we want better diagnostic tools, and it's all part of a larger picture. But this is not a partisan issue. We had 4 Republicans in the New Jersey Assembly, or House as you refer to in Pennsylvania, that voted yes to the bill, including Assemblyman Declan O'Scanlan, who is a Catholic and whose father is a doctor. He's a Republican and voted in support of the bill. I think, I've heard a lot of religious people actually state their support for this bill, saying, yes, well, I believe my God is a loving and compassionate God, and one that gave me free will. I've heard that as well. But in terms of the religious rights involvement with this bill, since that's a large part of the reason why we're here to talk about it, Massachusetts had a similar aid and dying law, very similar to New Jersey and Oregon's. And the Catholic Church in the last week before the ballot measure vote, so instead of a legislative measure, it would be everyone weighing in and all the members of the public voting on it. The Catholic Church pumped $5 million in efforts in negative ads against the bill, and it ended up losing by a very small margin. So the reason why we generally try to go more for legislative measures than ballot measures is because ballot measures often come down to who has more money, and the Catholic Church has boatloads of that. And they are not afraid to use it against death with dignity, against aid and dying. So they fought us there. And Massachusetts has another bill, and we're gonna hope to have that passed in a couple of years, but you have to wait a little while after a measure is defeated, after an initiative is defeated. Aid and dying is legal in 5 states: Oregon, Washington, Vermont, Montana, and New Mexico. Some by legislative measure, some by ballot measure, and some by court decision. Catholic Church has been, well, not just the Catholic Church, but the religious right as a whole has been active in essentially all the states where aid and dying has become legal. They were active in a lot of campaigns. If you ever go to the State House for one of our lobbying days or hearing days, and I would urge you to come along. We love having people there to show their support for the bill. you'll often see a lot of members of the religious right there testifying against the bill with the basic stance of, well, these are my beliefs and they interfere with aid and dying, therefore you can't have your beliefs either because mine's right. And that's sort of the stance that a lot of them have, which is unfortunate. In New Jersey, the largest group against aid and dying is called New Jersey Right to Life. You can look them up on Facebook. I was a member, but they actually unsubscribed me, which I found interesting. I guess they knew who I was. They've done that a couple times. They've unsubscribed me from the group. I think I'm on there now, but it took a couple tries. In terms of their involvement, overall they are fairly organized, and they get organized around hearing time. You'll often see them bringing their families there, and they'll have a lot of mobilization to bring people on the hearing day itself. That's fine. That's fine. Part of this political process is allowing different groups to weigh their options and say, yes, we support this, no, we don't support this. How am I doing? Okay, I'm doing pretty good on time. I'm going to talk for another couple minutes. So they've been pretty involved there, and we've also had a lot of religious people be in support of this bill that have come to testify. We had a Reverend Gillian McAllister testify in support of the bill at the Senate Health Committee hearing in New Jersey a couple of months ago. I've had rabbis come to hearings and lobby in support of the bill. I met with the United Church of Christ pastor a couple of weeks ago over lunch, and he told me at great length why he supported this bill and why it was actually strengthened by his religious convictions. There have been a lot of people religious people that say their spirituality is what grows their strength with this bill. So I don't think that this, if you are a religious person, although it's quite possible you're not given what event we're at here for, I don't think that necessarily conflicts with your stance for supporting this, because this ultimately comes down to compassion and respect for other people's beliefs and allowing them to have them and decide what they want for their own end-of-life care. So that pretty much summarizes everything I was talking about. I'll bring in Barbara and then we'll do some Q&A, so thank you so much for coming.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Well, as Janice mentioned earlier, you may already know this because my case was well publicized, but in February 2013, I was arrested and I was prosecuted for a year on the charge of aiding the attempted suicide of my dying 93-year-old father because I handed him his legally prescribed morphine. It was a partly filled 1-ounce bottle, and he was permitted by physician order to self-administer it. But he took more than the prescribed dose that day. A hospice nurse decided he needed to go to a hospital to be treated for an overdose, and I tried valiantly to prevent that because my father had advance directives. He was adamant about not wanting to go to a hospital ever, and because I resisted that, they called 911. Police and paramedics came, and it started this whole thing. After a year, my case was dismissed. The judge who heard my petition for habeas corpus, which is a motion to dismiss, felt that the evidence against me was clearly just hearsay, unsubstantiated hearsay, and there was no evidence that I had committed a crime, nor that my father was intending to end his life when he took that morphine. So in the end, I triumphed, but it was a very difficult ordeal, certainly for me and my family, but the worst was borne by my father. He had to endure 4 days of hospital treatment, which he didn't want, and he suffered that entire time. So I'm going to talk about this at length on May the 7th, and I hope you all come back and bring people with you, because I'm going to tell you in much more detail than was ever revealed in media reports. But what I'm going to specifically talk about tonight is 2 ways in which religious conservatism profoundly affected this ordeal that I went through, and my father went through. And the 2 ways are, number one, in the law, and the second way was in one of the players of this case against me, the Schuylkill County coroner. Now, where this event took place was in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. That's where my parents lived, Pottsville, Pennsylvania. It's a 2-hour drive north of here. So it did not happen in Philadelphia. Schuylkill County is a small county, and Pottsville's a small town, population of 14,000 people, and it's a conservative and religious area. So I definitely think that had an impact on how this whole thing went down. But I'm going to talk a bit about the law, and I want to mention here that you will hear opponents of aid in dying refer to it repeatedly as physician-assisted suicide. Terminology matters. Suicide implies that there is a choice between living and dying. If you are already dying, your choice is, are you going to die one way or another way? Which way are you going to choose to do that, if you have a choice at all? So Ethan mentioned the analogy to the World Trade Center terrorist attacks, where there were a number of people, at least 37, maybe double that, who jumped out of the high floors of the Twin Towers. Now, they obviously chose to do that, and I'm sure there wasn't one of those people who thought that they could survive that fall. So they were choosing between death by falling out of a tall building or death by a fireball in a building collapsing. Not one of those deaths was ruled a suicide. Not one of them. So clearly, people make a distinction there. I'm going to throw a question out to you. Is suicide illegal? Does anybody want to take a chance and answer that? Anybody?
Kind of
Not
hard
you
to
guys.
prosecute somebody who's successful. It's kind
Well,
of hard to prosecute someone who's successful.
Well, the answer to the question, is suicide illegal, is no. It is not illegal in any of the 50 states in the United States. It's not a crime. That wasn't always the case. At one time,
What about attempted suicide, is that different?
well, I'm going to get to that. And-
Successful suicide.
At one time, it was considered a crime for a person to end his or her own life. And those laws were historically based on the religious belief that only God is the one who can determine when the time is for your life to end. So, if you try to attempt to end your life, that was considered a blasphemous rejection of God's gift of life to you. So people who attempted suicide and were unsuccessful would be jailed. And if they were successful, then the surviving family members would be punished. That punishment typically took the form of the local authorities seizing the assets of the survivors, leaving them impoverished. I think everyone would agree that's a very draconian law to have. And of course, now we consider ourselves a more progressive, enlightened society, and suicide is decriminalized. However, aiding a suicide in most states in the United States is still considered a crime and can be prosecuted. So, here's one issue with the law about criminalizing statutes that criminalize aiding and attempted suicide or suicide. Since that activity itself is decriminalized, laws that criminalize aiding a suicide or an attempted suicide are criminalizing activity that isn't even illegal. That is one of the facets where my very excellent criminal defense counsel made an argument in court that makes these laws unconstitutional. One might think that these laws were enacted to prevent people who are despondent from carrying out an act of desperation. I mean, that's probably the most favorable way to look at these laws. I don't look at them that way. A lot of these laws were enacted after Jack Kevorkian became famous for assisting people to die. So, in many ways, they were reactionary, and they were put in place by conservative legislatures. I don't believe that these laws were enacted to help people who were truly suicidal. And when I give my big talk, I'm going to give specific examples of why I don't think that. Another issue with these laws, and the one in Pennsylvania is very similar to other states who have criminal statutes against aiding a suicide, is the vagueness of the way the statute's written. Now I'm going to read to you what the Pennsylvania statute says. A person who intentionally aids or solicits another to commit suicide is guilty of a felony of the second degree if his conduct causes such suicide or attempted suicide, and otherwise a misdemeanor of the second degree. Now, a number of very intelligent lawyers looked at this and really couldn't figure out what they were trying to say. What makes it a felony on one hand, which is considered a more serious crime, and a misdemeanor on the other hand? And the big issue is, what constitutes assistance? What rises to the level of assistance? Is it handing a loaded gun to somebody? Which most people would probably agree. Or is it passing someone their legally prescribed medicine when they're in pain and they're dying? Anyway, the vagueness of this law allows it to be interpreted in a way that can fit whatever the belief or value system is of the prosecutor or the police who are doing the arrest. It's on that vagueness that my attorney also claimed that it should be declared unconstitutional. Now, we never got to the point where we got to really challenge the constitutionality because my case was dismissed before it even went to trial. So constitutionality wouldn't have even been brought up unless it went through, first of all, the county court and then up through the appellate divisions. So that whole issue has been left unresolved. But my attorney made a very cogent argument at my motion to dismiss. This law is so vaguely written that my mother, who was married to my father for 62 years and loved him, she could have been charged under this statute because my father was diabetic. He decided to stop taking all his medicines. So he had diabetes out of control, and guess what? My mom bought him chocolate candy and ginger ale every week because that's what he wanted to eat. He was dying. So what are we going to do? Enforce a healthy diet on someone who's dying because it's healthy? No, he got 2 pounds of chocolates every week and sugared soda. And she bought it for him and she gave it to him. She could have been charged with assisting a suicide because of the way that statute is worded. Suppose someone's dying of end-stage emphysema and you buy them cigarettes. You could be charged with assisting a suicide under that statute. Because really the statute is so vague, it's only limited by the creativity of the charging prosecutor. So that's one area where just the creation of that law, and with the whole background of religious prohibitions against suicide, is an issue, and it certainly played into my case. Now the other area had to do with the Schuylkill County coroner, David Moylan. Now, in many of the rural counties, the coroner is, they're all elected, but the coroner usually isn't even someone who's trained in medicine. It's someone who may have been a policeman at one time or funeral director, and they can take a state test and learn certain things and they can become a coroner. That's not the case in Schuylkill County. The coroner who was elected in 2012 is a physician. He's a radiation oncologist. So he would be well aware as a physician what would cause someone to die from a narcotic overdose. A narcotic of any kind, whether it's morphine or Percocet or heroin, the way it causes death is that it causes a person to stop breathing. It affects the respiration center in the brain. So a person who dies from an overdose dies because that person stops breathing. My father never stopped breathing. Didn't happen. He lived for 4 more days after this whole thing was set in motion, and he died from pneumonia. The coroner ruled that my father died from a morphine overdose, and he said that the manner of death was homicide. Now, this all became clear a few weeks after he released my dad's death certificate, because he then announced that he was running for United States Congress on a Sanctity of Life platform. He is an openly devout Catholic, and he's been a guest several times on this show in Northeast Pennsylvania. It's called the Sam Lassant Show. It's a right-leaning talk show. He said right out, "I am a pro-life coroner." He has said that the reason he decided to run for coroner is because of the sanctity of human life. That is more important than anything else. From the moment of conception to natural death. He also said in an interview that it's very important that every decision you make as coroner to determine the cause and manner of death, how does it affect the sanctity of life? And then he claimed he'd been doing that for a year and a half at the time of that interview. Now, I don't know about you, but I would prefer to have someone make a determination of death based on evidence rather than religious belief. So what was the evidence? The coroner and the police captain who arrested me attended my father's autopsy, even though they didn't need to, and it was in Lehigh County, 2 counties over. The pathologist was supplied information from the coroner's office, which consisted of hearsay. So the pathologist came out with this report and said that, oh yes, he died of a morphine overdose. I later had 2 independent experts look at my father's records for an objective evaluation, one of whom was a forensic toxicologist. They both agreed he did not die of a morphine overdose. Forensic toxicologist said this was not a lethal level of morphine by any means. And here's something else that happened. In evaluating all these records and the toxicology reports, my expert noted that my father's morphine levels were drawn in the wrong kind of tube. They were drawn in a green top tube, which has an additive in it. He said a coroner would know not to use a tube with an additive in it. My father's toxicology samples from the day he died were not sent into the lab to be analyzed until 13 days after the final autopsy report was released. The coroner held on to these samples in a supposed homicide case, and I will mention in here that in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, the average homicides in a year are 0. So he can't claim that he was busy working on other homicide cases. It's extremely rare. He held on to those toxicology samples for 3.5 months, stored them improperly, and the way we know that is because the samples were degraded. And anyone who deals with forensic samples knows that they have to be placed under lock and key and refrigerated at specific temperatures and has to be checked daily. Those results didn't come back, those final toxicology results didn't come back until 4 days after my father's death certificate was released. The coroner has hosted the Pennsylvania Pro-Life Federation at his place of business. Now, you probably are familiar with them because they typically oppose abortion, but they also take a very clear stand opposing any kind of aid in dying, which they term assisted suicide. Clearly opposed to it. They've been invited guests to the coroner's place of business. What ended up happening with the coroner is that he actually won the Republican nomination for that 17th U.S. Congressional District. He won it in a 3-way race. So it appears that his pro-life stance played well with a certain part of the electorate. I'm really happy to say that he lost the general election. So, and I'm stealing some parts of what I'm going to be saying on May the 7th, but even though he lost that election, you can't just be complacent. I mean, if that district had been drawn a little bit differently, or if he'd had some more campaign cash, he could be a member of Congress right now. So, I'm not going to go into too much more detail because I want all of you to come back here on May 7th and bring friends and family, and I'm going to give you a much more detailed description of what this ordeal was like and all the other factors that played into it. But clearly, opponents of aid in dying want to frame it as a choice between life and death, when in reality it's a matter of controlling how a person wants their lives to end. And yes, they often bring up the fact or possibility that physicians could be wrong, that you may not be terminally ill. Well, there are no guarantees when you're talking about healthcare issues. Whether you're electing to get a life-saving procedure that may not save your life, and you may be contracting all kinds of complications that can end your life. There are no guarantees either way. But 2.4 million people die every year in the United States. So I don't think they're wrong very often. All right. You'll hear anecdotes about miracles and wrong diagnosis and all that, and yes, they do occur. But I don't think they occur as often as the opponents would have you believe, because there are an awful lot of deaths in the country every year. So I think that's where I'm going to pretty much stop at this point, and we can field some questions, because I don't, my actual talk on this whole thing would take a whole session. So I'd be glad to answer any questions, or Ethan.
What do you take to die? I mean, what is this? Is it a pill? Is it?
It's barbiturate, and you have to take about 100 of them. I think it's 1,000 milligrams.
Are they pills?
They're capsules that you break open and you mix in water and they dissolve and you drink it.
Sometimes it's pentobarbital, sometimes secobarbital, sometimes cocktail drugs. It varies on what's available and what state you're living in at the time.
Mm-hmm. So it's not a narcotic, it's usually a barbiturate.
And can people buy this somewhere?
No, it's highly controlled. No, it's not easy to obtain. So you can only get it in the states where you go through the legal process.
Well, can it be prescribed by a doctor not to end your life, but to do something else?
Yes. This kind of gets back to the whole thing about aid in dying. Those of us who want it to be a legal and safe choice are advocating this legislation because it has safeguards in it, so that vulnerable populations are not targeted or coerced. So yes, you could probably find a physician who's willing to prescribe some amounts of this, and you could stockpile it, and it happens. It's an underground practice. It happens all the time, but it's underground, and because it's underground, it doesn't have safeguards. And we want it to have safeguards. No one who supports this movement is advocating for an unregulated type of process. We think it has to be regulated. But we also think it should be a viable choice for people who want that. And certainly if people's religious beliefs preclude them from accessing this choice, I certainly would not say they have to do it. Absolutely not. And I don't know, are all of you Pennsylvania residents?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, some are. Well, in Pennsylvania, State Senator Dalen Leach has introduced an aid in dying bill for a number of years. Every year, he's a Democrat from Montgomery County. And as to quote him, he says, "It always lies in quiet repose in committee until the committee's term expires, and then it doesn't even come up for debate in committee," which is the fate for most of these legislative initiatives for aid in dying. I mean, whoever controls the committee gets to decide if they even talk about it within committee. And if it doesn't make it out of committee, then it certainly won't get to a full Senate or House vote. So that's usually what happens.
Are the prospects any better this year?
No.
Well, yes, no, I mean, I don't think anything will pass in Pennsylvania this year, but now there has been a second legislator, Mark Rossi, from Berks County, who is also introducing this legislation. And the more it gets talked about and the more people make their wishes known, the more likely that this kind of initiative will pass at some point. It's certainly not going to happen quickly in Pennsylvania. We're hardly a progressive state.
No, it's not gonna happen anytime soon. Until the Democrats take over both branches of the legislature. And I don't think Governor Wolf is gonna be very eager to get into that. He's a Democrat, but he's a rather conservative Democrat. And I really don't think, I'm familiar with New Jersey because I work for the state government of New Jersey, but I'm a Pennsylvania resident. And this state is way behind. This is the most conservative state in the Northeast, and it's not likely to happen anytime unless there's a major takeover in 2016 or whatever.
Well, I would agree with you there that while Republicans control the House and Senate in Pennsylvania, you will never see legislation like this voted out of committee because the majority party has the chair of those committees. So it won't happen then. You know. Yes, sir.
The term aid in dying is a peculiar one for me. It seems to me that hospice is aid in dying, and the objections to hospice have been withdrawn for quite a while now. I know hospice itself was very controversial among conservatives for a long time. Is that really,
No, I
really
would
the best?
disagree with that. It's not, hospice is not controversial.
It used to be, no?
Well, it isn't. Now, here's one thing that may be controversial. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but in 1997, the United States Supreme Court, in 2 cases, ruled that terminally ill patients have the right to as much medicine as they need to relieve their pain, even if it advances the time of death.
Right.
So that allows the practice of voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. I don't know if you're familiar with Diane Rehm. She's a host of an NPR show in Washington, D.C. And she has been outspoken recently about the death of her husband. He died from he had Parkinson's disease, and it was becoming more and more progressive. And he was more and more debilitated and disabled. So he took that option of voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And the way they make that at all bearable for the person is they give them palliative sedation. What palliative sedation is the person is sedated so heavily that they're basically sedated into unconsciousness, so they cannot eat or drink, and then they eventually die. It took him 10 days to die that way. Now that is legal in every state. There are hospices, especially religiously affiliated hospices, that will have no part of voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. So it matters which hospice care you use.
Does that mean they force feed you?
No, you can't be force-fed if you have an advocate or, a legal power of attorney, or you have documents that say that. I'm saying this with a caveat, because my father's advance directives were invalidated. So
How?
they are not solid documents that can never be violated.
How would they invalidate it?
Because the police and the hospice became involved. He had, on every hospice entry was written that my father was, do not resuscitate. He had advance directives, legal power of attorney, but they decided that he needed to have treatment for an overdose. So they overrode all that, and they did that with the help of and the police assisted in that. So my father arrives at the ER. Do you think those medical personnel are not going to treat him when the police are standing right there? Oh, they did everything. They knew I was arrested. So, yeah, and I do not blame the hospital in any way for what happened to my dad. They were put in a very difficult position. And I later found out that many of the people who worked there were just horrified by the whole incident. But when you have a police presence in the hospital every day, looking at what they're doing to this guy, it's pretty frightening for the healthcare personnel.
If you take,
Hi, I want to just mention that 40 years ago, my mom had lost all her breathing pretty much and ended up at a teaching hospital in Bronx, New York, a good hospital, Montefiore. And we had discussed it prior to her being admitted. And she said, I don't want to come out of this hospital. It's over for me. I can't be. Bottom line was, they mentioned something called do not resuscitate, which was the term they used in those days. And I said, I want it written on her chart. I don't want us to just talk about it. And I have a sister, and we all were in agreement. And in all honesty, there was no problem with that. And I don't know whether it was because it was a wonderful team of doctors who understood that she wasn't getting better, and she was a practicing Catholic, but she had made her decision that that was what she wanted. So I always really respected that. And what I've seen post her death has been a nightmare. People who do have written directives in place, and the things happened as happened to you. And in my youth, I remember hearing Governor Mario Cuomo when they at maybe the Democratic convention, and he was making this speech, and someone said, "Well, how do you feel about abortion?" And I admired him so much because I knew he was a Catholic, and I thought, what's he going to say? And he said, my job is one thing, my religion is another, and if my daughter chose to have an abortion, that would be her choice. And I always admired him for not messing up these things that we're really talking about here tonight. So, thanks.
Yes, and you know, clearly, where conservative religious people want to insert themselves in your lives have to do with how you're born, how you die, and who you have sex with. They really want to be a part of that whole thing. And the rest, they don't care. So,
yeah, my father had food and water mortality. He had a brain aneurysm, but interestingly, my three sisters and brother, my brother is his family is very religious, but we were all in agreement about that happening. And the nursing, my parents lived in a retirement community, and he was in the nursing unit, and they provided literature and stuff explaining this whole thing. It was all very quiet and dignified, you know, which I think probably happens a lot.
well, and I will say, because I'm speaking in a number of states throughout the country about my experience, and I always do a Q&A at the end, and I will say that it's about even. The number of people stand up and say, we had a wonderful experience with hospice. They were fantastic. They did everything to keep my loved one comfortable. And there's just as many people stand up and say, it was terrible. The problem is, how do you know who are the ones who do it right and who are the ones who are going to violate your loved one's wishes every step of the way? You don't know that. There's no way for you to know that. I mean, I do talk about this, and I'll mention some of it here, I'll mention it again on May 7th, that the best thing you can do if you need hospice care or a loved one is to interview several hospices before you choose one. And Compassionate Choices, who I am working with too, has an end-of-life consultation service, and it's in the CNC magazine in the back. It's a free and confidential service. And when you call this service, they will not recommend a specific hospice. But what they will do is help you know what questions you should be asking when you interview prospective hospices. And that's a tremendous help. Because anyone dealing with an end-of-life situation for a family member or themselves, you are very, very vulnerable. I mean, it's a stressful time, you know. So any help you can get to manage that time within your family, it's a big help. So I highly recommend that end-of-life consultation service, and the number's there. And that's really the best thing I can recommend, because there is no public data available about quality of hospice care. It doesn't exist. So it's really a difficult time. Sir?
I would definitely recommend. I worked for the State Department of Health in New Jersey. I'm also a registered pharmacist in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And New Jersey is definitely a better state than Pennsylvania, absolutely. And hospice care, I think, is done pretty well. I would say I would avoid places that are associated with the Catholic Church. But this is a redneck state that I live in, no question about it. And that would
no one compares Pennsylvania being progressive.
That would not have happened in New Jersey, I don't think. I really, despite its faults, and I support these Ethan's initiatives very much. We need to improve, but Pennsylvania is in the dark ages as much as it possibly can be. Just read the literature from the political literature online for the political parties in this state, and you'll see how strong right to life is. Read your Schuylkill or read a Dauphin County GOP party platform. It's embedded in it. Not so in New Jersey. And I do think that they do a good job in the hospices and I've been in every hospice and nursing home in the state of New Jersey, and I think that they do pretty well. And I haven't worked in Pennsylvania in that capacity, but from what little bit I know, it's a different story.
You had it in the back.
If you take this stuff, what do you just get sleepy and go to sleep?
Yeah.
There's no pain and so forth.
I mean, if you ever watched the documentary How to Die in Oregon, the two people that are shown taking the medication, both are quoted as saying it's so easy before they passed away. The average amount of time between someone taking medication and falling asleep in the 18 years this has been legal in Oregon is 5 minutes. On average, before the person falls into a coma and passes away, it's about half an hour. That's how long it was for Brittany Menard to pass away. Brittany Menard lived in Oregon, and her husband Dan Diaz noted that she passed away in a very peaceful manner.
Why do we have so much trouble with the death sentence when criminals take all sorts of medications as a death sentence that doesn't work?
That's injection.
Well,
Right, it's a different manner of delivery. It's a different medication.
wouldn't that solve their problem also?
Well, the manufacturers of the drugs that used to be provided for executions are no longer selling them for that purpose. They won't provide it, so that's why they're left with having to choose alternatives that don't work as effectively.
I know in Europe they don't require the 6 months terminal illness. In many other countries, in Netherlands, Germany has been approved, and Switzerland. I'm not sure how many of them. They don't require that you have a 6 month terminal illness. They may require that you be terminally ill. But I would think it might be harder on someone if they have to suffer from a debilitating condition for a longer period of time versus the 6 months. Has there been a problem with people that have longer than 6 months to live not being able to access the medication?
You're talking about pretty much ALS patients, I suspect.
Or Parkinson's.
Yeah.
I mean,
Or
you
MS.
really, you have to have the terminal diagnosis. You can have these progressive neurological diseases, but if you're not, at least by two physicians, considered to be likely to die in 6 months, no, you're not eligible to access aid in dying. Yes, sir.
To point out how red the state is, when the 4 candidates for governor were running, not one of them was against fracking, which I couldn't believe.
Right.
I know it's nothing to do with it, just point. But I wanted to say that when you were reading the Pennsylvania law, which I appreciated hearing, it didn't differentiate between end of life and somebody 25 years old and depressed, who we don't want to commit suicide, compared to somebody who's ill and about to die in pain. You know, and you of course explained that the whole proselytizing of language is what it's all about, so that, in my opinion, perhaps wording it better, which we're not in charge of doing that, it camouflages what we're talking about. It's end of life in serious pain, as opposed to just committing suicide. And your example was great about jumping off the tower and so on. There is no choice. And it's a prayer to end the agony, which is in a way religious, you know, but that's too poetic for them, all right. Thank you.
Well, I think that wording was very carefully chosen by the legislature
Oh, absolutely.
when they wrote that.
Yeah,
Because you can interpret it
right.
many ways.
Sure.
And you have a valid point. It doesn't differentiate between people who are dying and people who are young and have the possibility of
depressed.
a life ahead of them.
Right.
And when I do my regular talk, I actually talk about some cases specific